Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here. Welcome to Nobody Likes Moderate. This week's issue is going to be gun control. Fun. There was yet another tragic shooting at a school in Oregon this week, and I'm sure if you watch this 3 years from when it was actually made, insert some other place because it's been movie theaters, it's been elementary schools, it's been high schools, it's been churches. We have a problem with gun violence in this country, and we seem to go through this cycle again and again where tragedy strikes, people suffer, people have died, there's horror, and then we have a national dialogue on gun control, and then nothing happens, and then it happens again. So I'm going to ask that whenever we're talking about this kind of stuff, we just put our own egos aside for a split second, maybe open our opinions up to accepting that maybe we could be wrong, maybe there's just a wider perspective to this issue, and I'm going to try and suss some of this stuff out now, but as always, I'm not an expert, I'm a musician, this is just my stuff, my thinking, so, feel free to call me an idiot at the end, but I hope that somewhere in here the dialogue changes to be a little less polarized and be a little bit more solution oriented so that maybe some of this stuff doesn't happen quite so much. All right, first, when we're talking about gun control, we aren't talking about a singular thing. The idea of gun control can range from making specific legislature about the use of firearms, selling of firearms, issuing of licenses, need of a license, to these very unspecific things like making guns illegal. So a lot of these conversations have no real center because there isn't an established specific subject. We just kind of end up talking past each other with whatever we are perceiving the subject to be. So I think the first step to a better dialogue is going to be getting rid of the idea of gun control and just talking about specific ideas that are under the umbrella of the bigger idea of gun control. Now, I can't get into all of that stuff in this video because I'm not an expert on all the possibilities and things like that. I just think it would be a whole nother video, and hopefully somebody who's smarter on this subject will make that video. But I'm going to discuss some common rhetoric just to sort of break down the dialogue. This is something that I hear in defense of guns all the time. Number one is owning a gun is a constitutional right. Well, the Second Amendment oddly does not grant the right to own a gun. It grants the right under the condition that there's need for a militia. However, it's also fair to say that our Constitution was formed as a response to an oppressive government, with the intention of preserving personal autonomy, which is really important to us Americans in case you happen to be overseas and watching this and wondering, why are we so hung up on having guns? Because we're really big on personal autonomy. The hinging factor being the pursuit of property. The ownership of guns as a personal right was to ensure that one could own their own property, and as such, sovereignty depended on the ability to protect that property. And one could also argue that the natural rights, the right to life, is fairly meaningless without the right to protect that life. This is not really just my opinion. Actually, I'm not a constitutional law expert, but this is the current opinion of the Supreme Court. They ruled on this recently and said, yes, the Second Amendment does guarantee the right to own a gun. Okay, here's one for more gun control. Tighter gun control equals less gun violence, less restriction equals more. So it's really important whenever having any kind of discussion about any of this stuff to understand that a statistic is a number. It's just a data point, which is great because it is hard and fast solid, but it's not a conclusion. A statistic doesn't mean much without context, and so it is not the end. It's simply a clue to getting to the end. Another way of saying this is that corroboration and causality are not the same thing, and I'll give you an example. New Hampshire and Louisiana, they both have very unrestrictive gun laws, and they fall onto almost completely opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of gun violence, with New Hampshire having some of the least gun violence and Louisiana, I believe, having the most. So, corroboration, not causality. There's also a myriad of odd statistics like number of guns in circulation has gone up, but gun ownership has gone down. Deaths by guns has gone down, but gun-related violence has gone up. And these statistics don't paint a clear picture of what's really happening. Okay, so this is one for an argument I hear against gun control a lot, which is, if we make guns illegal, only criminals will have guns. So the black market is not like an actual market. You don't go down to the black market to go shopping. Obtaining an illegal firearm is a vastly different proposal than, say, buying drugs at the corner. That being said, we have a fair mix of mass shootings where people aren't using firearms that they personally owned. Columbine and Sandy Hook, the shooter simply stole the guns from a legal owner, a family member in both cases. So, if we make guns illegal, criminals will have a much harder time getting guns. However, it will not entirely prohibit psychopaths and people who are deeply invested into the criminal world from getting guns. So I give that one a yes and a no. Okay, so number 4, we need tighter background checks so crazy people and criminals don't get guns. Okay, that's a wonderful thing to say. I don't think anybody really wants nutcases or criminals to have guns, but there's a bit of a divide between theory and practicality on this one. One of the biggest problems with mental health in America is that it is radically stigmatized. What kind of a background check do we do to determine if somebody's too crazy to own a gun? Do we violate their doctor-patient confidentiality and figure out why they're going to a psychologist? Is going to a psychologist even reason to not give somebody a gun? To me, that sounds like it's putting the burden on people who are trying to get healthier and help themselves, rather than putting the burden on criminals. The other side of that is doing a psychological exam as part of the issuing of a gun license. What would you put on that questionnaire? Psychology is not a hard and fast science. It's not like you can fill out a bunch of multiple choice questions and then everyone's going to know if you're crazy or not. That's not really how it works. So, yeah, theoretically, it's great to say psychological examinations and background checks make sure nutsos don't get guns. But in practicality, that just sounds like a huge violation of people's civil rights. Background checks, yeah, I think background checks are important. We don't want people with aggravated assault on their record or robbery on their record buying guns. That's fair to say. But how far does that background check go? Where do we stop? What determines whether or not somebody can own a gun after that? We already have that in place, and I don't think people are really debating it. So, I don't know. It's an easier said than done, I think. All right, so number 5, this one is for the anti-gun control folks. Guns don't kill people. Without guns, people will just find another way to hurt each other. Guns are really effective killing tools. They're more effective than bombs. They're more effective than knives. They're more effective than chainsaws. They're way less cool looking, but way more effective than flamethrowers. They are designed to be killing tools. And I think that's a difficult point to argue. At the same time, there is something to be said for utility not being the determining factor. Just because something can be used for something doesn't mean that the responsibility should be placed on the item rather than the person. I mean, it's fairly obvious that maybe nuclear bombs and bazookas might be a little bit much for personal ownership, but obviously things like knives, well, I'd like to be able to cut my dinner, so knives, yeah, that's cool. I think that the end result of this is somewhere in the middle. Maybe certain weapons are just too militaristic for people to personally own because they can just cause way too much damage, and some weapons are perfectly fine for personal defense or for hunting. It really just depends on where we're drawing that line, and I think that that line is negotiable, and it's not just a yes weapons or no weapons kind of thing. Number 6, we need more guns to protect from people who have guns. So this argument kind of sounds ridiculous at face value, and in certain extensions of the argument, I think that it is. I've heard it suggested that teachers should carry guns to the classroom, or even be required to, or encouraged to. If I was a teacher, I think I would quit. I didn't sign up to be a security guard. There's so many things that could go wrong with that. Student could get shot very easily. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. A gun could go missing from the drawer. Like, teachers have enough responsibility. Maybe that's not a good idea. But the other side of it being, is it possible for there to be no guns in the equation? Well, with roughly a third of our population owning guns, I don't think it's so realistic that new gun laws would actually deter people from running into schools and such like that. I mean, maybe over time, possibly, but certainly not in the immediate future. So I can't help but sort of personalize this argument. We need more guns to protect from people who have guns, because it actually happened. To my sister, a mentally ill patient with a gun walked into a hospital while my sister was there on the floor on duty, and he shot and killed someone, a social worker. There was a doctor there who happened to have his gun on him and shot the patient before he could shoot anyone else, like possibly my sister. So ideally, neither of them would have had a gun. But in this particular case, I'm pretty glad that that doctor broke the hospital rules and snuck his gun into that hospital because I might not have my sister anymore if he hadn't. Anyway, since I've made this personal, whether you are for more gun control or less, I think it's absolutely worthless to even have the conversation without framing it in another person's shoes. People have suffered because of guns, and people hold true to their patriotic beliefs about the need to have guns. Like, this is a deep subject for people. And overall, my personal feeling is that many attempts at tighter gun control would fail and never truly benefit people. But if I were to have a conversation with a person who was a victim of gun violence, skip that. If I were to have a conversation with someone whose child was shot and died, I'd make a pretty concerted effort to do more listening than talking on the subject of guns. These aren't one-sided or easy issues, so I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. Try and have an open mind. Try to do more listening. Maybe we'll find a situation where we can preserve our right to have guns and also reduce the amount of gun violence that's in this country. Anyway, if you don't like what I said, it's not that surprising because nobody likes a moderate. Till next time.